Just before Dr. Rora made the presentation, I told him it is very difficult for me to provide the response because in the last 6 months, I graduated from Fuller about 2 years ago, and in the last 6 months, in my practicum about the growing from first-generation immigrant church to the multicultural church, I drew some of the sources from his book, The Next Evangelicalism. So I'll be honest, it is very difficult for me to provide the response, but one thing that I'm really interested to speak to you is one of the 5 factors that he listed as the factors that can grow a first-generation immigrant church. And I agree with all those 5, the worship in the home language, the maintenance of the homeland culture, the importance of fellowship community, and then the provision of social services, and then lastly, the restoration of social status. But what I'd like to respond tonight is on the 4th factor about the provision of social services. Because it is so... Our church is still in journey, and we started our church in 1987, but didn't become the full embracing second generation church until 2006. It was 6 years ago, and then from there's a pressure and tension from our second generation to grow from the second generation church that's focused to Indonesian children, but to grow to embrace other cultures to be brought into the church. But it is taking us about 6 years journey to grow from the second generation church to become a multicultural church. The reason why, because there's a different narratives being spoken by the first generation and then the second generation. And as we started the church for the first generation immigrant, we focus on this provision of social services. Unknown to us, it leads to them to the narratives of scarcity. And so everything is about self-preservation. Everything is about inwardly focused. So when there's a demand from our second generation to start an English service on Sunday, wow, it is like a big jump for the first generation. It took us 6 years to appease them, to make sure that we are not abandoning them. And then there's multiple conversation happening between the parents and the children. And then not only that, just from the second generation, they speak about the narrative of abundance. When, for example, we know that Asians always emphasize 3 things, right? Asian parenting is very easy. It's divided by 3 things. And my friend Christopher Yuan, the author of the Out of the Far Country, sharing with me that 3 things that common to Asian parenting is first, education, get A's. And then secondly, obey your parents. And then thirdly, piano. So, and that's no, and it is a valid reason. That's the reason why many of our children are doing very well. In fact, one of our children is her drawing. She's so gifted in drawing, and her drawing is being featured in LA Times. So these second generation children are so hungry. Looking at our neighbors, 50% of them are not finishing high school. So they came to me and then asking, Pastor, can we become a blessing for our community? But it hasn't happened yet until now. Why? Because the parent culture, speaking on the narrative of scarcity, they still see that our needs are not being met. And then sometimes I have to honest, being the pastor, to bridge the 2 sides, it is very tiring. And one thing that really shifted my focus and to help me understand the parent generation, the needs of our second generation, is the story from Dr. Seuss, The 500 Heads of Bartholomew Cubbins. Because in that story, in the kingdom of Did, and then the king name is King Darwin. So on one day, King Darwin went into the balcony of his castle, of his palace, and then out of the balcony, he looked downward, and then he saw beautiful homes of his noblemen, the beautiful homes of the wealthy, and then down the road, and then he saw the homes of the town folks, and then finally, and then he saw the huts of the farmers. And looking at that view, he felt so mightily. But on the other hand, the Bartholomew Cubbins, and then when he stepped outside his home, out of his small door, he looked at across the huts of the fellow farmers. And then he looked at across is the little homes of the town folks. And then he started going upward. And then he saw the beautiful homes of the noblemen, the beautiful homes of the wealthy. And then finally he saw up there is the palace, beautiful palace, the king's balcony. But does Bartholomew Cubbins have the same view as the king? No. Bartholomew Cubbins looked at himself as a small person. And then by reading that story, now I understood why our second generation is getting frustrated, because they are being felt small, because they are being marginalized by their parents' generation. So with that, I have to go back to the parents' generation, see and asking them to see that what we are doing now is leading to the path that where we have been able to maintain them in the church. But if we do not reframe our understanding to change our view from the self-preservation culture, from the culture of scarcity to become a culture of abundance, that we have so many heritage. And in the book, Dr. Rah has mentioned that as an ethnic church, we have so much to contribute to the wider church. And so slowly, I have to help and reframe the idea and thinking of our church. And then thank God now that slowly we are embracing. And a few months ago, we started our first English service. So I have 2 minutes left. So in closing, I will share this. And I have mentioned earlier, being the first generation, being the pastor in this two-culture church, it is very tiring. And there are days I like to just to give up, and I like just to pass on to the next pastor. And then sometimes reading your book, I'm so tempted that probably from the get-go, I will just start a multicultural church. But looking back, I didn't lament the experience that I had. Why it took 6 years to grow an English service in our church? Because it is like planting a bamboo tree. The first year, you sow the seed, you plant it, you fertilize it, nothing happened. Second year, you still fertilize it, water it, nothing happened. Third year, same. Fourth year, same. But in the fifth year, something happened. The Chinese bamboo tree started to sprout. And in 6 weeks, it grew 90 feet tall. And that is my prayer and my hope that our church can become the Chinese bamboo tree.
It's my privilege and honor to respond to Dr. Soong-Chan Rah's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Rah, for your insight and well-researched presentation. I didn't know Dr. Rah, but now I came to know him, and then I'm happy that I personally know him. As a fellow Korean American, I'm proud of you. You did a great job. Dr. Rah touched on 4 important issues that challenge both the dominant or majority Caucasian churches and marginal immigrant churches in USA. First, Dr. Rah discussed about the next evangelicalism, and second, cultural intelligence. Third, the ecclesiology of a multicultural church. And the fourth issue, the navigating the generation. I am responsible to respond to this issue. The disillusioned generation, which is about the cultural and generational divide among Asian North American churches. The cultural and generational divide is made evident by growing disillusionment among the first generation. The panelists were required to prepare a written response to read. So, to keep time, I'll read the written response. This cultural and generational divide are well defined in Asian North American circles. The next generation is somewhat lost between the Western culture in which they grew up and were educated, and their parents' culture at home. The way they speak and think, they are Western or American, though by physical features, they are very much Asian. They are both Asian and American, but not exclusively one or the other. The first generation immigrant Christians are very conservative about their cultural heritage and religious practices. Their attachment to their culture is very strong. The immigrant churches are typically exclusive due to, as their members having difficulties in learning a totally new language and adapting in the new culture. As an example, most of the Korean churches planted by the first generation immigrants are almost exact copies of their churches in Korea. First generation immigrants have a high expectation for their next generation to keep the language and culture of their homeland. However, the mindset of the next generation is much different. They are more eclectic and inclusive. That leads to a growing tension between the generations. This tension rises to surface when the second generation, next generation, have reached the position of economic independence. The disillusionment of the next generation is a serious issue. Personally, I feel sorry to hear about many second generations leave churches because of a lack of relevance or sensitivity in their church. The silent exodus of the next generation is heartbreaking. One way to address this problem is for the next generation to affirm each other in the communities of faith that understand them. It is interesting to note that next generation Asian North American churches have been attracting not only Asian North Americans, but also people of all colors and cultures. One example is a New Song Church in Orange County, California, led by Dave Gibbons, a Korean-Irish American pastor. Pastor Gibbons' personal identity crisis led him to discover a vision of helping people like him, a misfit and outsider, find their own place in the community of faith. While I applaud the birth of a new communities of faith, catering to the disillusioned generation, I wonder if it is the only way to solve this problem. Can the church mend its way to attract again the disillusioned? How do we navigate the generations and cultures to a meaningful and relevant participation, empowered in the ministry? As a first-generation immigrant, church leader, and missiologist, I propose to the following. First, ethnic or immigrant churches should continue to catering to the needs of their members through spiritual and social means. The growing number of immigrant churches affirms the effectiveness of its objectives and programs. Second, the church must encourage intercultural dialogue and help its members to understand other cultures. It must also provide opportunities for new immigrants to master the language, the English language, and understand American culture. Third, church leadership must be instrumental in breaking this ethnocentricity. Asian ethnocentricity is as bad as an Anglo-Saxon sense of superiority. They can do so by supporting other ethnic ministries, especially those that are limited in manpower and resources. This lessens any cultural tension and promotes unity in the body of Christ. Fourth, the church must motivate members to cross the cultural divide between ethnic, immigrant, and mainstream churches. I'm reminded of Joseph and Daniel in the Old Testament. They, without losing their cultural and spiritual identity, became part of the mainstream during their time. Another example is the Harvest Rock Church led by Cheon, a Korean American who has successfully formed a hybrid of a mainstream and multicultural church. Fifth, the ethnic churches must empower the next generation by allowing them to evolve. They can achieve this by investing resources in developing second-generation members to become better leaders, pastors, missionaries, because they are highly adaptive to cultures, able to speak English fluently, and can easily learn other languages. Because of their ethnic looks, they even have a better access to countries where white missionaries are not as welcome. Six, the church should consider structural changes by allowing members of the next generation to sit in positions of influence and leadership, together with elder leaders. They should affirm the second generations and acknowledge their potential and expertise. There is a great advantage in agreeing to disagree than to be bitter. When it is inevitable to separate, they should be generous in giving blessing to them. Finally, solicit the second generation service and involvement in activities like global mission, community service, social justice courses, etc. Be supportive to the next generation ministries, including those outside your denomination. While there's no simple solution to this challenge, we can positively look at it as an opportunity to reflect, redefine our purpose, and set new direction according to our needs and opportunities our God is leading. Thank you.
Thank you so much for very well thought through and great moving forward, which is I appreciate that we can begin to have the analysis of it, but how do we begin to move forward in how this finds application in the church? I really appreciate, and I hope we can kind of continue to expand on this idea of moving from scarcity to abundance. And this ties in with what I said earlier about the theology of suffering and celebration. And I think maybe the idea of a triple consciousness and the idea of a second generation who come out of a suffering narrative because their first generation went through these struggles, moving into a celebratory narrative because of the success story. And I don't want to overgeneralize because that's not true for everyone, but we can say kind of generally speaking, many Asian Americans have entered into a success narrative after the first generation and into the second generation. How then do we begin to integrate the two? And I think maybe part of it is not to reject the scarcity story that helped understand suffering, but to be able to see this as the whole narrative. And that's why I'm saying part of my journey has been as a second generation Korean American not to so easily dismiss the first generation, and that scarcity was not a spiritual negative. It actually could be a spiritual positive. And these are very important questions for us. And when we get into the multi-generational ministry of, I'm just not sure how healthy it is for us as second generation, as kind of a self-critique, to spend a lot, and this is weird coming from me, spend a lot of time criticizing and saying negative things about our story when actually that needs to be embraced, and to see it as in light of a very powerful part of our growing narrative. Peter Chow has been a wonderful friend and mentor to me, teaches at Trinity, gave me this illustration, and I'm going to share that with you about how that first and second generation dynamic might actually operate. He uses the image of the beaches of Normandy. And if you saw Saving Private Ryan, you remember that very vivid scene of that wave of soldiers coming in and literally the bodies littering the whole landscape because these people are giving their lives to it, and the dead bodies are strewn all over the beach. But then that first wave was able to establish a beachhead, a bulkhead, and dig the trenches there where the second wave could come in and take hold of that beachhead and still try to go against, but they needed those trenches. They needed that first wave. And I think when we start thinking about second generation ministry, we need to acknowledge that first wave that literally gave their lives in many cases for the benefit of the second. Sorry, I just thought about my mom and the literal dying that they did for our behalf. And so the bodies that are strewn that we can recognize and say, our parents died for us so that we could be in these trenches. And when we do that, we go to these trenches and we can, as a second generation, say, boy, it's nice to be in this trench. Let's kind of, maybe put some flat screen TVs up here, order some takeout, and we got a nice little trench going for us here. Or we can say the sacrifices that were made by the previous generation means that we have the greater responsibility to take it to whatever is coming next for us. And I think that's where the second generation maybe needs to have that kind of framework that shifts from our parents' sacrifice ultimately leads to, and the scarcity that they operated out of leads to a higher motivation to say, well, now maybe there is a possibility for us to kind of go to what might happen next for us. And so are there images that we need to engage in understanding our first generation? The disillusionment, and Dr. Park is referring to a chapter that I did in the Honoring the Generations book. I co-authored this with the pastor, a younger covenant pastor in my denomination, who was started a multi-ethnic church coming out of a first-generation Asian American church. And how then does that disillusioned generation begin to do church planning and begin to do active ministry? So I appreciate some of the challenges that we need to look at when we start moving in that direction. Are there patterns that we carry with us into the second generation? I really appreciate you talking about Asian ethnocentricity, because that is something that is not just a product of the first generation. It is clearly a possibility into the second generation. Again, I kind of allude to the Normandy imagery of the Saving Private Ryan imagery of how can we empower the next generation to not just staying in those trenches, but to actually go into the next generation. The idea of the highly adaptive culture, I can't remember who said this, but I think that the Asians have passport face. And I'm trying to remember who used that phrase one time, in that our face can get us into pretty much anywhere that we want to on one level. And does that translate to mission work? And does that translate to our work in cross-cultural American, in the American church? I think we lose that passport face. I think we lose that cross-cultural narrative when we are captured by the dominant culture's narrative only. One of the things that I have been blessed with in my personal experience, in fact, a moment that just kind of laid me out was after the book came out, my first book came out. I mentioned this earlier. Bill Purnell gives me a call. And Dr. Purnell affirms the work that I did and saying, you're saying what I've been trying to say for years. And I was really challenged by Bill Purnell's work when I was in seminary, reading The Coming Race Wars. And then I kind of tried to dig up all the things that Dr. Purnell had written. And for him to affirm that was a very powerful testimony for me, that as an Asian American, in a very, very crazy way, I could somehow reflect the stories of the African American community. Was a very moving moment for me. And so how are we as Asian Americans, because of our cultural abilities and cultural experiences, represent a voice that has been historically silenced? So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm really, really nervous about how the Asian American can become the token minority voice in a lot of our settings, because we will usually parrot the dominant culture voice and not be the prophetic voice that I think we should be. And that makes me nervous, because what we've done is we have become the Uncle Toms of American Christianity, where, hey, look at the good Asians. They get their degrees from Fuller. Hey, look at the good Asians. They're able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And then we become the Uncle Toms of American Christianity. And I'm not sure that that's a role that we should play. And part of that means we need to reflect the voices that we are hearing and engaging in out of the other cultural experiences as well. I'm interested by the investment into the second generation. This is a really fascinating topic for me. I don't have the data on this. It's just kind of I'm in other areas of research now. But I would be curious, because I studied the development of American Christianity from 1970 to 1990, and that's kind of the heyday of it. But what happened was that the most of us, the second generation, are children of that wave of immigration, right? So my parents came to the U.S. in 1973. I'm a product of that. Many of the people that are in their 20s and 30s and 40s now are second generation that are a product of that wave of immigration in the 1970s and 1980s. And then there was a little bit of a lull in the 1990s, and then I mentioned there was a little bit more of a blip in the mid 1990s when the IMF crisis hit. I might be getting the dates a little bit wrong, but it goes like this: there was this height, and then a little bit of a drop, and then it kind of shoots up again. Again, this is more anecdotal. What I saw in my sister's church, my sister goes to a Korean American church, is that during the time when there should have been that investment into the second generation, the first generation churches had a numerical blip that increased their numbers. So I saw this in my old church where I was, my first church plant that I was involved with, it was intentionally meant to be a cross-generational church, Korean-speaking and English-speaking together kind of on equal terms. And our senior pastor was perfectly bilingual and was able to run the board meetings and speak at both services, which is a big thing. When the senior pastor preaches at both services, that's a pretty major deal. And so when we started, there was this kind of this equality, and there was this investment by the first into the second, in that the senior pastor can spend his time with the second generation. The board was evenly split between the first and second generation. But what happened was that the first generation the church grew at a lot faster rate than the second generation. That took a little more energy and effort. And that the second generation, especially when that blip occurred, where in the 90s, when there was this whole wave of young, 20, 30 something to our first generation now. And did that take away some of those resources? And again, I don't have the data on this, but what I've seen is that story kind of played out, where in my sister's church, they had a church that was kind of had stabled off, I think in the 90s, 500-member Korean-speaking congregation. Their English congregation was about 100, 150. Maybe that's the time you invest a lot of resources. You bring in an EM pastor. But that happened around that time is when the whole new wave of Korean immigrants came, and that Korean church is now not 500 Korean immigrants, but 1,000 Korean immigrants. So when it comes time to hire a new pastor, what's the priority? It's not the EM pastor. It goes back to the Korean pastor to hire, because that church is growing. We need to hire more pastors for the Korean congregation. And I'm wondering if that kind of stunted a moment where that investment could have occurred, but it didn't, because of that second wave that came in and actually fleshed out the numbers for the first generation. But did that cost the second generation at some point? And now do we need to refocus and say we need to maybe make some of that investment again for the second generation?